Chapter 17, the final chapter. To know where you are going is always a great comfort to travelers, which is one reason that skilled navigators were as highly prized in Miss Penelope Lumley's day as those clever robot-voiced direction-giving gadgets are today. It also explains the enduring popularity of guidebooks, and the fact that crawling back through a dark, damp tunnel was not nearly as frightening as the first trip had been. This time, Penelope, Simon, and the Incorrigibles knew precisely where they would end up. Soon they were outside the museum once more. Just as they had hoped, the sword-wielding thespians had scattered. Presumably they had returned to the Drury Lane Theatre to perform the second act of Pirates on Holiday. Madame Ionesco had disappeared as well. Penelope wondered if the Pirates' second act performance would be at all improved by their lessons with Richard Burbage, but alas, she wouldn't be there to see it. Oh well, she thought to herself with a twinge of disappointment. Half of a West End premiere is better than none, I suppose. The important thing is that the Incorrigibles are safe from those silly pirates. And we did manage a trip to the British Museum, finally. The children will have much to write about in their journals tonight. The children, indeed. Their russet-colored hair looked almost gray in the color-stealing light of the moon, but each time they passed beneath a street lamp, the auburn sheen glowed like an ember. It was the same color as her own natural, unpoulticed hair, and of Agatha Swanbourne's, too. What could that mean? The whole moonlit walk back to Muffinshire Lane, Penelope looked at the incorrigible children with fresh eyes. Alexander, Beowulf, and Cassiopeia. Lost, or perhaps stolen from their parents. Left in the woods at Ashton Place. But by whom? Improbably, unexpectedly, found by Lord Frederick Ashton and taken in as his wards. Then, of all the governesses in the wide, unfathomable world, Miss Penelope Lumley of the Swanbourne Academy for Poor Bright Females had been chosen to raise them, educate them, and as she now understood better than ever, to protect them from harm. Somehow it was all connected. They were all connected, she and the children, and perhaps even Agatha Swanbourne too. But how? What did Miss Mortimer know that Penelope did not? And how did this inhuman curse that Madame Ionesco spoke of figure into things? Moon, 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 the children chanted, expectantly as they marched home. And then, "Was moons?" they wondered. For now that the hour was late, the full moon had risen too high in the sky to be reflected in the windows of the buildings. The glass rectangles were dark as inky pools. And now there's this business of paintings to puzzle over as well, Penelope mused. She recalled the night that she and the children had discovered that strange mural in the attic of Ashton Place. She thought of the mysterious howling sound that they'd faintly heard from the hidden place behind the wall. What is the connection? She scrunched her eyebrows together to better summon her powers of deduction. What? Moon, 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 the sleepy children mumbled. It had been a very long day. Cassiopeia had run out of pep completely and was now riding on Simon's shoulders. Moon? Penelope realized with growing excitement. Moon, moon, moon! Yes! For it had been a full moon the night of the Christmas ball, and it was a full moon now on the night of the Pirates on Holiday premiere. Both nights had ended in mayhem, with the children being pursued, or hunted, if you will. Lord Frederick had been absent from both occasions, the holiday ball and the premiere. And earlier that very night, Penelope had gotten a howlingly good clue as to why. Either there were wolves living in the attic, she thought, recalling Lord Frederick's bizarre behavior, or Lord Frederick was hiding inside, having a peculiar fit of itching, barking, and howling that is in some way related to the full moon. Voila! She exclaimed, feeling thoroughly pleased with herself. Simon and the children looked at her questioningly. No French lesson, Lamouou. Too tired, Cassiopeia begged. Penelope smiled. French can wait until tomorrow. I merely have had an epiphany of sorts about something I have been wondering about for some months. Now, shall we sing the Muffin Man song as we walk? Unlike the children, Penelope was feeling quite energetic all at once. It's a lively little tune, and will keep our spirits up. Look, everyone, we're almost home. Voila, as you may already know, is a French word that means, there you are, like Eureka or by Jove, I've got it. And voila is sometimes exclaimed by people who have figured out the answer to some sort of problem or riddle that has been vexing them to no end. But why would Penelope use a French word like voilà when she was nowhere near France? It is a reasonable question, and the answer is this. There are French words and phrases that only French-speaking people use, and there are French words and phrases that everyone uses. This is because some ideas are so perfectly described en français that no other languages dare try to top it. As an example, consider the phrase joie de vivre. It means the joy of living, and refers to the kind of cheerful, non-stop zest for life that stops just short of optimism and makes a person a sheer pleasure to be around. Gauche, or gauche, I think, actually, means terribly awkward. A provocateur is a person who tries to stir up trouble. And then there is a faux pas, which is an embarrassing blunder or lapse of good manners. Translated into English, faux pas means false step, but faux pas are done all the time. Everyone makes mistakes now and then. Simple errors can be fixed with an eraser, and more complicated blunders require an apology and a sincere effort to make things right. Either way, most mistakes are soon both forgiven and forgotten. They are a fact of life, and one ought not to lose sleep over them. Sometimes, however, for no reason that science can yet explain, a perfectly ordinary faux pas is not forgotten at all. It becomes the subject of gossip and soon attracts the attention of the media, after which it escalates into a crisis of vast and humiliating proportions. Alas, the newspaper that was delivered to number 12 Muffinshire Lane that morning after the premiere of Pirates on Holiday contained a report of just such a mistake, one that was already well on its way to causing embarrassment on a global scale. It was not part of the paper's scathing review of the show itself, which, despite the enthusiasm of the audience, was deemed a colossal failure, sure to fold in a week, what were they thinking, by the Times' chief theater critic, who had never been wrong about such things, although, to be fair, the critic also wrote, some unexpectedly fine acting in the second half was not enough to salvage this barnacle-encrusted wreck of a show. No, this scandal of the day was reported on the Times Society page, which, after a few lines speculating about why the King of Belgium was a no-show, devoted the rest of the column to mocking the tasteless garb worn to the premiere by one Lady Constance Ashton. What I fail to understand is how the incorrigible children could behave so abominably, and yet all they cared to criticize is my outfit. Lady Constance had read and reread the society page so many times, and dropped so many salty tears upon it, that she now had black ink smudges all over her hands and face. Frederick, listen to this. Clearly unused to London's citified ways, the childlike, or is she simply simple, Lady Ashton attended the theatre in the most absurd fancy dress imaginable. A word to the wise, only actors wear costumes, dear. And this, Lady Ashton's pirate get-up was so gauche as to be illegal. Quick, somebody, throw her in the brig. You missed one, dear. Lord Frederick shook open the business section of the London Times, drew it close enough to see, and read, The London stock market shows modest gains yesterday. And speaking of stock, Lady Constance Ashton was the laughingstock of the West End last night. What? Enough! She shrieked, and buried her head in her hands, weeping. It got worse. The 11 o'clock post brought floods of mail, as did the next post and the one after that. Letter after letter arrived, all addressed to Lady Ashton, and all withdrawing the social invitations that had so recently been extended. Plans had changed, unexpected house guests had arrived, and hosts had suddenly contracted malaria, dangerous tornadoes were expected. The excuses piled on. None of the date cancelers was so bold as to pin it on the eye patch, but the message was clear. Because of a single rhinestone-studded faux pas, overnight Lady Constance had become a social pariah, which is to say, the sort of person absolutely no one who cares deeply about being popular would have anything to do with. No, no, dear, it will soon blow over. What? Lord Frederick looked a bit worse for the wear himself, with scratches on his hands and face, and a lingering tendency to clear his throat in a particularly barky way. But at least the itching and howling seemed to have subsided. The papers are just having a bit of fun, that's all. Can't take it too personally. What? Penelope, too, was in a bit of a muddle. She and the children had made it home without incident. Simon, she called him Simon now, imagine that, had parted with fond good nights and a mutual word of admiration for each other's pluck in a tough spot. She'd slept like a rock and dreamed only of alpine meadows filled with appealing little songbirds. But now it was morning, and she had to decide what to say to Lady Constance about the previous evening's mishaps. Rather than wait around to be fired, or for Lady Constance to threaten to ship the children off to an orphanage or dump them back in the forest, as she had quite rudely proposed after the wreckage of the holiday ball, Penelope wanted to take the bull by the horns, matador-like, as it were, and offer her own side of the story. For really, who ever heard of a parrot trained to howl? Someone was behind all of this, and the children could hardly be blamed. At least, not entirely. She sent word through Miss Clark, requesting an audience, but no reply was forthcoming. It seemed Lord Frederick was spending the day at home for a change. He and Lady Constance had not left their private rooms since the arrival of the morning paper. Perhaps if he is still in the throes of his moon-induced condition. If so, at least it is keeping him near his wife, Penelope thought. No doubt she will be in a better mood because of this much overdue attention, and our conversation will not be as difficult. Was she being up to too much stick? The possibility did not cross her mind. Finally, well after tea time, Penelope received word that Lord and Lady Ashton would receive her. She smoothed her drab, blackberry-colored hair and proceeded to the dining room. There was a large pile of unopened mail on the table near Lady Constance. With a maniacal look in her eye, Lady Constance slid open each letter, quickly skimmed its contents, and then proceeded to tear it to bits, which she carelessly let fall to the floor. By this time there was a snowdrift of torn-up paper heaped around her chair. Lord Frederick sat at the far end of the table with a hot water bottle on his head, an ice pack pressed against his eyes, a glass of schnapps in front of him, and a small pill bottle of headache lozenges next to the schnapps. Too nervous to wait to be asked to sit, Penelope began to explain and apologize the moment she entered the room. Lady Constance simply opened and ripped, like a human shredding machine. When Penelope finished speaking, Lady Constance stood. She handed Penelope what was left of the society page of the Times, which of course Penelope had not seen, as it had been in Lady Constance's agonizing clutches since the moment it arrived. Lady Constance waited as Penelope digested the awful contents of the page, and then she spoke. Miss Lumley, I will be blunt. Last night was the worst night of my life. My humiliation is complete. My friends have cut me off, and my reputation is in shambles. I'm convinced it was no accident. Someone is to blame. Her eyes narrowed. And I know exactly who it is. You do? Penelope was amazed to hear it. Were all the many mysteries that had accumulated since their arrival in London about to be solved? Yes, I do, affirmed Lady Constance. The source of all of my troubles, past, present, and future, is those 3 incorrigible children. The children, but they had nothing to do with your... Penelope might have said, your ill-chosen outfit, the rudeness of the gossip colonists, and the faithlessness of your so-called friends. But she did not, for Lady Constance was clearly in no mood to hear the truth. Of course it was the children, Lady Constance declared. Nothing good happens when they are near. They're unbearable, intolerable, incorrigible. She turned to her husband, who had his feet propped up on the table and looked only half-conscious. If only you had been there, Frederick, you would have seen how wild and uncontrollable they were. Why, they actually stormed the stage and attacked the pirates. They disrupted the performance completely. Lord Frederick yawned and then grunted from beneath his ice pack. If I were a lad and stumbled across a gang of pirates, it'd be bad enough. But if the ruffians burst into song, why, I'd be scared out of my wits. I'd probably start shooting just to set my nerves. What? Lady Constance retorted. Lord Frederick lifted the corner of the ice pack and looked at Penelope with one eye. She couldn't help think it was rather as if he were wearing an eye patch himself. About those incorrigibles, no loss of property, no damages to the wolf children. Still got the 3 of them, what? Yes, Lord Ashton, Penelope replied. How could he speak in such a careless way about the children? Never ceased to amaze her. That's all right, then. He yawned again and then groaned, then popped a lozenge in his mouth. But, Constance, dear, given all the unpleasantness, what say we go home to Ashton Place? I'm done with London myself. Much rather be out in the woods shooting, what? Lady Constance snatched the society page back from Penelope, tore it to bits, and threw the pieces on the floor. A brilliant suggestion! We'll leave at once! She ran to the bell and pulled on it repeatedly as she spoke. Paupers! Pirates! What a dreadful place London is! Wild horses could not induce me to return to this inhospitable city! Miss Clark! The ringing and yelling continued until Miss Clark arrived, not flustered and panting as she usually would be, but in her own time, with a serene expression on her face. Good afternoon, my lady. Dear me, what a mess of paper. Do you need help cleaning it up? I have no intention of cleaning it up, Lady Constance replied, momentarily thrown. I merely summoned you to announce we are leaving. Are you now? Miss Clark nodded and smiled. Where are you going, then? No, we are all leaving. We are returning to Ashton Place at once. Have the servants pack up the house. Why we ever came to London to begin with, I cannot say. It has been a nightmare from start to finish, and I, for one, have had quite enough. All of us, at once, Penelope repeated. Her mind raced. Surely she would get a chance to say goodbye to Simon. And Miss Mortimer had not yet replied to her letter. Why, she hadn't even met the children yet. Yes, all of us, much as I would like to leave you and those incorrigible children behind. She glanced at the half-asleep Lord Frederick and lowered her voice. And remember, my dear friend Baroness Hoover knows of some very fine orphanages for the poor. Take care, Miss Lumley, take care you do not lose your pupils to one of them. Lady Constance may have wished to leave at once, but packing up a household is not done by wishing. And Miss Clark did not panic and hurry the servants along the way she might have once done. Sure enough, staying calm and taking one's time made the work go that much faster, for without all the scolding and rushing there were fewer mistakes made and everyone kept in good spirits. Even so, it was another few days before the house was ready to be closed up. Penelope and the Incorrigibles made good use of the time. They explored London's sights at their leisure, without worrying too much about plans or maps, or even if the walk they took was particularly educational. The children, it must be said, liked the parks best, and Penelope did manage to purchase a pretty straw hat with a long pink ribbon that looked quite striking against her dark hair. Finally, it was time to bid the grand city farewell. Lady Constance and Lord Frederick went ahead in their carriage, driven by old Timothy, of course. The servants would stay until the very last spoon was polished and put away. Then they would take the train home, packed together like sardines in the third-class car. Penelope insisted on packing up her own things and the children's, too, their books and buildings and the many pages of their journals. She also had a goodbye to say and a long overdue errand to run. As it happened, both tasks were accomplished on her very last afternoon in London. Say, I wonder if the Queen actually reads them all, Simon remarked as Penelope dropped her letter in the suggestion box on Buckingham Palace. She must, said Penelope firmly, for she's a good queen, and that means she must be curious to know what's going on outside the palace as well as within. She gazed across the magnificent plaza that led to the palace gate. The paupers' food line was still in place, queuing up patiently around the side of the palace, the young, the old, the in-between, all just and hungry as downtrodden as ever. The royal house is warm and fine, the cold and hungry wait in line, Beowulf recited solemnly. Simon turned to him impressed. That's a neat little poem. Did you just think of it? Beowulf shook his head. Guidebook, he explained. It was from the Hicksby's Guide, entry on Buckingham Palace, Penelope said. Dear old Hicksby's. Isn't it odd? The book was scarcely any use at all, but I feel it a bit of 6s and 7s without it. I'd offer to get you at a replacement, but we both know it's not an option, Simon frowned. Awfully sorry it got lost, Miss Lumley. I mean, Penelope. It wasn't the most practical volume, but there was something rather charming about it. I liked it. I liked it too, although the advice about following the smell of elephants did nearly get me run over by a carriage. At that, Simon looked confused, for of course he didn't know the part about the elephants. In any case, she went on quickly, we're on our way home and won't be needing a guidebook anymore. Beowulf had brought some paper and a box of charcoal pencils with him, so he could make a few final sketches of Buckingham Palace, or so Penelope thought. He took this opportunity to show her his work, which as it turned out, was a delightful collection of alpine scenes. How wonderful! Penelope admired the drawings. Did you draw these because the Hicksby's book is lost, and you were trying to recreate some of the pictures? He nodded shyly. Alexander peered over his brother's shoulder at the pictures and pointed to the flowers in the meadow. Edelweiss, he said. Say, that's clever, Simon explained. Miss Lumley's got you learning a bit of German, does she? Now it was Penelope's turn to look confused. Why, no, it would be a fine language to study, but I don't know any German at all. Do you? Simon gave a humble shrug. Not really, just enough to read a bit of melancholy poetry here and there. Always had a taste for it for some reason. Then I must show you my favorite poetry book, she said excitedly. I've had it since I was a girl. It's an English translation, of course, but you might be familiar with the originals. My favorite is called Wanderlust. Say, I think I know that one, he said. Something about a meadow, right? A distant church bell tolled the hour. Clang, 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 clang. 4 o'clock so soon, Simon observed. But time and the tide wait for no man. That's an old sailor saying. What does it mean, Samawoo? Cassiopeia asked. I'm afraid it means we ought to go, Penelope said reluctantly. Before Simon could offer to escort them, she went on. If you don't mind, I should like to say our goodbyes here. She was in no hurry to part, of course, but she didn't want to become overly emotional in front of the children either. Somehow the sight of those stoic palace guards made her buck up a bit, with their imperturbable faces and brave fur hats. With the guards close by, she felt she could get through it without melting into sniffles or worse. All right, then. It was lovely to meet you all. Simon sounded flustered and kept staring at his shoes. Perhaps you'll come to London again sometime. Or perhaps not, considering all the excitement. But with luck we shall meet again. I do hope so, said Penelope with feeling. Ashton Place is not so very far by train. Maybe I'll pop in next time I'm headed out to see my great-uncle Pudge in the Ancient Mariner's Home. It's in the same direction, more or less. North by northwest, Alexander guessed. That-a-way, Cassiopeia pointed. More or less, Simon grinned sheepishly. All right, then. Safe travels to you. Good luck and fair wind. Thank you for the inspiration. Cheers. Simon's feet seemed stuck to the ground by some stretchy gummy substance. He kept picking them up as if to go and then putting them back where they'd been. Weil Gluck, Alexander added. Danke. Auf Wiedersehen. Aren't you a clever boy? Simon ruffled his hair. Alexander beamed and waved. With a tug on his hat, Simon finally managed to make his exit. After he was gone from sight, Penelope thought that she might write some melancholy poetry herself. Cassiopeia noticed her governess's mood right away. Lama was sad, she asked, concerned. Simon, goodbye? No, not sad, Cassawoof. Forgetting her professional distance for once, Penelope scooped the girl up in her arms. I'm pleased to be going home, in fact, and as for Mr. Harley Dickinson, what could be more pleasant than making a new friend? Later, after all their things were packed for the morning train and the Incorrigibles were put in bed, Penelope took out her favorite poetry book and read, I wander through the meadows green, made happy by the verdant scene. What a coincidence that Simon should know Wanderlust. It was hardly as popular as To a Mouse by Mr. Robert Burns, or even The Wreck of the Hesperus by Mr. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, another particular favorite of the children. In fact, Wanderlust would be considered obscure and little trafficked as poems go. But unexpected things had become such a frequent occurrence lately, nothing really surprised Penelope anymore. Was it optimistic to think that her friendship with Mr. Harley Dickinson, with Simon, that is, would be able to continue? Penelope certainly had her own opinion on the subject, but as Agatha Swansburn once said, time will tell, but only in hindsight, for time is not talking just yet. All in all, it had been a very interesting trip. This is Epilogue, so the actual real last chapter, I'm going to keep reading it mixed in with this one. At Ashton Place, the mail came only once a day. It was a simple, reliable system, and now that they were at home, Penelope realized she much preferred it to the constant flurry of postal deliveries that they had endured in London. For what mattered most about any letter was how one felt about the sender and the news he or she had to share, not how many hundreds of invitations one could brag about receiving. 10 days after their return to Ashton Place, 2 letters came, both addressed to Penelope. The first was on the most elegant stationery Penelope had ever seen. To my loyal subject, Miss Penelope Lumley.
Thank you for sharing your concerns in the suggestion box. We were not at all amused to hear that scoundrels were attempting to make a profit off the paupers' food line tickets. I have instructed the palace guard to put a quick end to any further attempts to exploit this charitable service. I was intrigued by your idea that something more substantial be done to improve the lot of the poor, so that they would be, in fact, no longer poor. I am not sure how this could be accomplished. However, I shall consider it. Miss Lumley, I can tell from your clear thinking, good grammar, and tidy penmanship that you are a superior governess. This reflects well upon your own education. I will be sure to seek out graduates of your alma mater should the palace ever require additional staff to care for the princes and princesses. They can be quite a handful. Your faithful sovereign, Queen Victoria.
Well, it's not every day one gets a letter from the Queen, Penelope thought, with a bit of satisfaction. And it's good news for the Swansburn Academy, too. I shall have to let Miss Mortimer know. Speaking of Miss Mortimer, the second letter was, in fact, from her. My dear Penny, how delightful it was to see you in London. I deeply regret we didn't have the opportunity to meet again while you were in town. Soon after our scrumptious meal at the Fern Court, I was called away on family business. I'm sorry for the delay in response to your letter, which has been forwarded from my London hotel and which I only received this morning, upon my return to dear old Swanburn. I am especially sorry that I did not get to see the children. I will in the not-too-distant future. That is a promise. By now you have likely returned to Ashton Place. At the risk of sounding like a nagging headmistress, though of course that is exactly what I am, I want to remind you again to use the hair poultice on schedule. The importance of maintaining a healthy scalp is not to be sneezed at, and lice are no picnic either. About the other matters we spoke of, some of which you raise rather forcefully in your letter, Penelope, I must apologize. I see now that I was being too much stick in thinking I could squelch your natural curiosity and power of deduction. You are not a child any more, and you must follow your brave heart where it leads you. But be careful. Keep your curiosity within reason, and do not let your questions go overboard. Any further visits to the attic of Ashton Place, in particular, would be taking things much too far. At lunch, you asked me a question regarding the possibility of inquiries being made for you at Swanburn. Upon reflection, I believe I owe you a fuller answer. I will tell you this. The persons of interest have not forgotten you. In fact, they recently sent you a collection of picture postcards, though of necessity it had to be disguised as something else. Think about it, Penelope. You will surely understand what I mean. I do hope the guidebook proved of use. Yours, Miss Mortimer. Picture postcards? She meant the Hicksby's guide, of course. The Hicksby's guide was from her parents, the long-lost Lumleys, now a little less lost. And it was gone. Penelope didn't care. It was from my parents, she thought, luminous with joy. I held it in my hands. I looked at the drawings page by page. I remember each one. The lakes, the mountains, the ibex, that funny-looking mountain squirrel. How she wished she might see those pictures, and perhaps hug the book to her one last time. But I wonder why it had to be disguised, and where the Lumleys, my parents, are now. How strange it was that Penelope could scarcely remember her mother and father, or the home they must have once shared. North, south, east, west. Where could they be? Navigation, you see, is not just a problem for sailors. Everyone must go adventuring sooner or later, yet finding one's way home is not easy. Just like the North Star and all its whirling, starry brethren, a person's idea of where home is remains in perpetual motion, one's whole life long. Home was more than a house, even if the house was very grand. The Ashtons had lived in Ashton Place for generations, but Lord Frederick seemed loath to spend time there. Whereas Penelope knew quite well that home was not a fixed point on a map. Home used to be the Swanburn Academy and Miss Mortimer, and now it was wherever the Incorrigibles were, and wherever her favorite books were. If the place was equipped with a cozy chair to read in, so much the better. London was certainly a marvelous adventure, but it's good to be back at Ashton Place, she thought. And even with so many mysteries left to solve, just knowing that her parents were alive somewhere, thinking of her, made Penelope feel more settled than even the most soothing cup of tea ever could. It made her feel at home inside herself, which was a very good thing to feel. She thought of these things the whole rest of the day, and when the Incorrigibles wanted to hear "To a Mouse" one more time, for the incorrigible children of Ashton Place liked to hear their favorite read-alouds over and over again, just as children do to this very day, Penelope's interpretation was a wee bit more philosophical than it usually was. "So you see, the poor mousie lost her home when the poet plowed over it, but that doesn't mean she has no hope of ever having a new one again. It simply means she will have to build it. And who knows, it might even prove nicer than the one that was lost," she added. "What do you children think would make a good home?" "Bouncy beds," said Alexander, who often had to be reminded not to jump on his. "Friends," suggested Beowulf, holding up A Friend for Rainbow from the Giddy Up Rainbow books that Penelope kept on the nursery shelf. "Friends, of course," Penelope agreed, thinking of Simon and Miss Mortimer. Yes, friends were absolutely essential to feeling at home. "Pets, pets, pets," Cassiopeia said as she fed treats to an ecstatically chirping Nutsawoo. The overjoyed squirrel had been spoiled rotten since the children returned from London. He showed no interest in the journals and postcards except to chew on the corners, but kept coming back to the nursery window to beg nibbles of the flat, round cakes that Miss Clark had asked the kitchen to prepare, since the children liked them so much. Bouncy beds, friends, pets, good things to eat. Penelope closed the collection of Mr. Burns's poetry that she'd been reading from. That sounds like a fine home indeed. "And Lamawoo," all three children piped up, falling upon her. "Hugs, not licks, please," Penelope reminded them, but she couldn't help laughing. The children obeyed, for the most part, and Penelope, who tended to be cheerful in any case, felt happier than she could recall feeling in a very long while. The end.